The first white spot was the size of a dime, and I found it on my upper inner right thigh at the age of 6. And following it were many more white spots on my arms, on my feet, my neck, my back, my chest, my face, my hands, my elbows, everywhere. And these spots became patches as they grew and combined. I am Indian. I was born, brought up in Malaysia, and being darker skinned at that time, these white spots and patches that were appearing on my skin were very glaringly visible. As any worried parents would, my parents took me to a host of doctors. None of them were able to correctly identify and diagnose what I had. And so my mom took to the internet. And this is 1998 to 1999, when the internet's still a pretty big deal. So it was a brave thing for her to do. It was a time-consuming thing for her to do. And after much searching, she eventually did find out what was wrong. Vitiligo. Vitiligo is an autoimmune disorder that affects about 1% of people in this world. And it occurs when one's body thinks that the melanin or pigment cells in one's skin are foreign or invasive cells, and it starts to kill them off, resulting in depigmentation and these white spots and patches appearing all around the body. And it manifests itself differently from person to person. For me, I would get these white spots and patches, and if they were exposed to sunlight, more specifically ultraviolet light, my body would realize that I was not getting the protection that pigment cells normally would give me for the sunlight. And so I would get these brown freckles, and my pigment would return until I reached an equilibrium point again, when things would go back to depigmentation. So I began treatment. I went on steroids, shots, topical creams, herbal remedies, pretty much everything you can imagine. But the most effective treatment was ultraviolet treatment, because like I said, when these white patches were exposed to the sunlight and ultraviolet light, they returned to their normal skin color. And doing this outside in the hot Malaysian sun wasn't really an option because I didn't know how much light I was getting. And I remember one day I sat outside, and after walking back in, a few hours later, my legs were covered in shiny pink blisters, just like bubble wrap, because I didn't realize how intense the sun was. So my father, a genius in my books, what he did was he built me a panel of ultraviolet lights that I could sit in front of in a controlled environment. And I remember exactly what they looked like. There were 6 lights, 3 on top and 3 at the bottom, surrounded by reflectors to increase the intensity of ultraviolet that I would receive. And they were within a wooden box that was painted white and brown at the bottom. And on the right, there was a panel, a gray panel, in which there were switches, silver switches, buttons, a buzzer, and a timer. I remember these lights would give off this blue glow that was almost heartwarming, and I would sit in front of them 1 to 2 hours every day. And it's a funny thing, but I often wonder, what did other kids do during this time, during this hour or 2 I spent every day in front of these lights? And did I miss out on anything? And it's a funny thing to think about, because these lights made up such a big part of my childhood. I remember that blue glow so well. And so this UV treatment, it was working. I could see progress, but it was only working so long as I did it. As soon as I stopped, I would see the vitiligo spread to new parts of my body very, very rapidly. And I soon discovered I was fighting a losing battle, which is when I chose another route, to let it completely take over me. And just for the sake of becoming one color again, become white. This meant no more treatment, but it also meant no more going in the sun, which is difficult in Malaysia where it's summer all year round. And I remember in school we had uniforms, and the girls would wear skirts, and I would have to wear pants. I would wear a full-sleeved turtleneck physical ed uniform instead of the short sleeves, and I had a lot of arguments with my mom about not wanting to do this. And a lot of the times I'd win, but then I'd have to pay for it with sunburns. But I'm not going to say it was rough, because it wasn't. I was never bullied like so many other children with vitiligo are. I had really supportive friends and family. I had access to medication. But I will say that it often felt unfair to be singled out, to have to skip activities. It was unfair. And 11 years later, after making that decision to completely depigment, I'm standing here today and I'm pretty much entirely depigmented, as you can see. I still can't go out in the sun, which is surprisingly a problem in Vancouver too, because when it's sunny outside, everyone just wants to be outside. So I'm one of those people who likes rainy days in Vancouver. So today was a pretty good day, and I think for a while from now on, it's going to be good days for me. But there's one thing you have to understand about vitiligo, is that it doesn't have hard medical effects on the body just on its own. In a study done with over 100 patients over 10 years of what their main complaints of vitiligo were, the top 3 complaints were fear, shame, and insecurity. And you look at these 3 and you realize that they all have to do with what other people think of the patient, or what other people have to do with the patient. It is not about their own personal lives. It is about their interaction with society. And another thing you'll notice about these 3 points is that they can be applied to a range of other situations, be it a medical condition or a challenging life situation or a decision to make. Now, you're probably wondering by now why I'm telling you all of this. Well, for one, I want more people to know about vitiligo because I think it's important to raise awareness. But secondly, and more importantly today, I want to tell you what I learned from it. I'm a geography major, and the moment I said that, I saw a few puzzled faces around the room going, "What? That's totally disconnected." But give me a moment and I'll tell you why it's not. As I started to study human geography here at UBC, especially feminist geographies, I began to notice my life experiences intertwined with a lot of the academic feminist geography theories that I was learning. And I created a web of thoughts in my mind that allow me to articulate what I am to you today. And I will particularly look at situated knowledge, perceptions, and society. And I'm mostly going to draw on Edward Said and Donna Haraway as I do this. They're 2 superstars in geography, and so I picked them. And you'll also notice that I take geographical concepts and pull them out into our everyday lives. And I think it is totally okay to do this, and I justify this because I completely agree with Edward Said when he says, just as none of us is outside or beyond geography, none of us is completely free from the struggle over geography. That struggle is complex and interesting because it is about ideas, forms, images, and imaginings. And you'll understand a little bit more as I go on. The first thing that I have learned is that knowledges and perceptions and attitudes are not static. Donna Haraway says that we are limited by who we are and where we are, and it is very easy to privilege our own point of view. That is fairly obvious to some. And she says that the only way that we can really test and even see our prejudices is by interacting with each other. And so what that means is that if you and I have a conversation, and one of us or both of us is able to change some of the ways in which we think, or make and unmake some of our prejudices, if we can understand that that can and does happen, it means that we're one step closer to knowing how to engage other people and to bring them into our ideas and to get some of their ideas. I'll give you a little bit of an example. When I was younger and I would go to the supermarket in Malaysia, I would often see people stare at me. I would see parents pull their children away from me around to the other side to keep them away from me, probably because I looked weird or ugly or freaky. But I learned very early on not to be offended by that, because for one, my sister would say, well, they're all staring at me because I'm famous. And it's ridiculous for how long I believed her. But secondly, I learned that these people weren't bad people. They were just people who hadn't interacted with me and who I hadn't gotten the chance to talk to and tell them a little bit about me. And I knew this was true because there was no one who was important to me in my life, or there were none of my friends who had those same negative perceptions towards me. And it's not because I miraculously had the most politically correct friends ever. It was because they'd taken the time to accommodate me into their knowledges and into their perceptions. So I'm not for 1 second saying that everyone's knowledge is perfectly malleable and we can just all interact with each other and everything's going to become okay. In fact, I think we all know that's not, because there's stubborn people everywhere who make that very hard for some of us and who can make life very difficult for some of us. But what I am saying is that this is a perspective to look at individuals within our society. It is that engagement and that connection we have with other people that can get us through a lot of barriers and that can teach us so much about each other. This isn't a recipe either for how to live life easily, because it's not, because this engagement can be the toughest thing you ever do. And I say that we live in a world of connections, and I think Donna Haraway summarizes that quite well when she says there, we're inside of what we make, and it's inside of us. We're living in a world of connections, and it matters which ones get made and which ones get unmade. So going with this idea of perceptions, we also have to note that we have our own biases too, and we should be open to unmaking and making those. So a lot of what I've said so far might seem a little fluffy to you. You might say, well, Swinzle, I already know that. Why are you telling us this? We see this in class all the time. We learn about it. But what I'm saying is that for just one moment, even if you have to close your eyes to do this, think about all of the connections you have in your brain, all of your knowledges, your perceptions, your biases, your beliefs, your morals, and picture them in a great bubble of connections in your head. Think of your schema. And now think that the entirety of that is constructed by the people around you and your surroundings. And without that, the entire thing would collapse. This is why society is so important, and this is why real interactions are so, so important. The enormity of that is pretty breathtaking, and I think if we all took the time in our everyday lives to constantly acknowledge this, we might be a society that was perhaps more social and definitely more compassionate. This is my knowledge. This is where my knowledge is situated, and I don't say that I'm right when I say these things. In fact, sometimes I might say that I'm wrong, and interacting with you might correct me. I think Edward Said puts this more aptly when he says, with so many dissonances in my life, I have learned actually to prefer being not quite right and out of place. If you forget everything else I've said today, remember that it is your attitudes and your interactions with others that make you who you are, far more than your circumstances. And it is those blue lights of my childhood that flicker on in the back of my mind and remind me to be kinder to others, to listen to others, to acknowledge where others are coming from, and to know their situated knowledges, to see how we can come together and interact, because at the end of the day, we are all connected and all of our knowledges are made up by each other. Thank you.